A pleasure to me all at last, and welcome back to Films I'm Willing to Talk About Again. And let's just say that there's a lot of films I'd be willing to talk about again at this point, including one that certainly has seemed to slip some people's minds. But then again, there does exist such a thing as a cult following. And this film has been regarded as one that definitely should have been a big-time success for DreamWorks. The Road to El Dorado, released in March 2000, quite a while before the majority of other well-known 2000 films like Thomas and the Magic Railroad, Scary Movie, The Emperor's New Groove, and Cast Away were all released. This was basically an earlier portion of the whole new millennium that we all got to experience together at some point. I was not even a year old in the year 2000, but yet it's certainly worth knowing. By this point in time, the film industry certainly has gotten itself a whole new approach, with a lot of things out there relating to film adaptations, parodies, and whole lots more. It also is worth knowing by this point that with other such films out there that relate to mythology, or anything that has been described as fables, El Dorado, the Golden City, which of course had eventually been debunked thanks to the likes of the video game series Uncharted, which began years later. But in 2007, when Uncharted Drake's Fortune came out, it turns out, according to it at least, that El Dorado is not a golden city, but a golden shrine that holds an ancient curse. But in any case, with earlier iterations of how El Dorado itself actually was, the Spanish city of gold entirely was in fact depicted in a way by DreamWorks that certainly actually seemed possible. In this film, it follows the likes of a Spanish conquistador who is hoping to set out for sea. But then we eventually cut to a group of thieves known as Tulio and Miguel, whom are played by actors Kevin Kline and Kenneth Branagh. But these two, in fact, find a mysterious treasure map after doing some gambling with a set of dice that are in fact loaded. They get chased around the city and eventually find their way onto this conquistador's ship via a bunch of barrels. They get captured and get sent to a brig in hopes of being sent to a slave camp in Cuba. They eventually find a way to escape and take a horse with them. And this horse is in fact done by the likes of talented voice actor Frank Welker. So, by all means, it's pretty much off to a good start. It does follow a pretty relevant plot, with some nice detailing and some pretty clever humor by all means. I mean, it also is a lot of meme material by any means, especially the shot of Miguel playing a guitar-like thing. I mean, that alone was pretty much what made it memorable, on the internet at least. But in any case though, the three eventually find themselves over to a raft where they float out and about in the middle of nowhere until eventually reaching an island that is occupied by some adventure. They eventually set forward into the jungle, going through all sorts of various things, until eventually following the map over to a point where a large waterfall appears. Eventually they get forced inside, and turns out this waterfall does hold the fabled, ancient, legendary City of Gold itself, El Dorado. But the real kicker in this film is the fact that these two Spanish thieves, whom are in hopes of taking the gold in El Dorado and using it as a way to gain financial success in Spain, they do in fact actually get appraised by the locals, who see them as gods. That right there is very uplifting. Could you imagine at some point you walk across an ancient city that you didn't even know existed, and all of a sudden people think you're a god? You're their leader, who came from an unknown land somewhere out in the open. I mean, there's a lot of controversy on that part to this day. Sentinel Island and all, but by all means, this film certainly does happen to have some pretty amazing peace of mind. It's got a well-written plot, a well-known cast, and some pretty nice things out there, considering that this was one of the earlier portions of DreamWorks before the likes of Shrek, How to Train Your Dragon, and an all-new film that might start a whole new series known as The Bad Guys. So, this was way before that, pretty much. But in any case though, I do consider this film to be pretty impressive. Looking at it today, it's probably nothing all too special. But I actually do consider it to be so well that, I keep it on a Netflix list because of this reason. In addition to that, I do also own a copy of the soundtrack, which was written by Elton John and Hans Zimmer, as well as some collaborations with Hader Priya, Trilogy, and Randy Newman, who was also a well-known composer for the time. Looking back at Elton John's career though as a musician and a composer out there, probably the last biggest piece out there that was done alongside Hans Zimmer might have been The Lion King in 1994. This was years prior. But by all means, The Road to El Dorado actually does amp up the talents of compositions and sing-alongs with this film entirely. Being that this was years later and they managed to brush up their skills a lot more so than ever, these two certainly did put up an incredible show for all of us to see. Instead of a series of lions on the Pride Rock, we have a group of Spanish thieves who are out finding a lost city of gold. Certainly a bit of a more believable trait by any and all known pieces of adventure and artistic catalog. But by all means, do we not consider this to be the perfect film? Simply because of a variety of reasons. It did not do incredibly well in the box office. It got some mixed reviews at the time, and most people didn't necessarily seem to care for it all too well. It sure did have a pretty good amount of actors in it, by all means. Not just Kenneth Branagh, Kevin Kline, and Frank Welker, but also Jim Cummings, the voice of Winnie the Pooh himself, as the one and only conquistador, who technically does act like one of the main antagonists in the film, alongside a member of El Dorado, who apparently discovers that Tulio and Miguel are not in fact gods, and sets out after them with some sort of psychic-powered stone giant. It looked to be some sort of Canaan breed. I don't really know for sure, but by all means, that certainly is quite a twist. A twist that we kind of already saw coming, because we kind of knew that Miguel and Tulio were mortals by all means. They had the ability to shed blood when they were wounded and all that good stuff that only we could do. So, it was kind of obvious by this point that this twist was bound to happen, and the members of El Dorado and the Golden City itself would have eventually figured it out that they were not real gods. They were just some visitors from an outside world. So, but eventually that pretty much gets figured out and eventually duped down in almost an instant, as Miguel and Tulio sail away on a ship alongside their horse, along with a huge pile of gold that they intend to take with them all the way back to Spain. But unfortunately, because of what had happened outside, they thought that this one person might have died after supposedly being defeated and all, but in fact had actually lived, and would actually stumble across the conquistador who was out looking for Miguel and Tulio after they had escaped the ship on the sea. But in addition to that, we also get the fact that the climax itself, which is about them actually destroying the gateway with the ship itself in order to seal off El Dorado for good, to protect its secrecy and to not let any knowledge of it escape to the outside world. So eventually it is found that El Dorado is apparently non-existent. But it is, in fact, existent only to the likes of those whom had escaped from it. And so, that pretty much is what that film is entirely. The main characters that we've known managed to escape, out and about, on their way back to Spain, pretty much. Through the jungle, out to their raft probably, or something else entirely. I really do have to say, though, that the likes of Elton John and Hans Zimmer's soundtrack is pretty enjoyable on its own. But it's worth knowing by this point that Elton John had actually released a separate album at the same time, known as The Road to El Dorado. So Elton John basically has a Road to El Dorado album, and then on top of that, there's actually a movie, The Road to El Dorado, which actually does use its own variations of titles from this album, including Trail We Blaze, Friends Never Say Goodbye, Someday Out of the Blue, and of course, El Dorado itself, which does in fact appear at the very beginning of the film in a somewhat animated roll call, title card, and other such things that appear at the very start, just like with most movies that we've seen back then. But these days, we don't really get that all too much. Kind of a sad thing to know, but that's what happens when you have more than 20 years of innovation following close behind. Yet, I do feel like that The Road to El Dorado, while it might not have been as huge of a success, it sure is looked upon as a great film these days. Any of us can watch it on any sort of streaming platform, and we can all feel satisfied knowing that this was an amazing welcome addition prior to that of many successors like Shrek and How to Train Your Dragon. But knowing that we're actually getting a whole new series, well, we first have to see how this first film goes on. But maybe the bad guys might be the next best thing to both of these franchises. And so, there might even be the likelihood that in the 2030s we'll see something else as well. So, with that in mind, that's just all I have to say about that whole thing. It's a great movie, but it certainly did not bear a whole lot of significance at the time, nor might it bear a whole lot of significance today, even with a lot of the following behind it. And if you want to see more go down on my channel, then make sure that you like, subscribe, comment, follow me on social media, and stay on the Hollywood side.